In the first section of this week, we saw the non-aligned movement and the Bandung movement emerge in the United Nations with a group of 77 as a formulation of the background of Third World neutralist politics. The second theme was the emergence of a women's rights movement within the non-aligned movement as a vessel for women's rights in the international arena. The third theme this week is going to be focused on, in this section, the case of developmentalism. Now, previously, when we looked at the Third World and the Second World and the First World, we divided these up as sort of sections focusing mostly on politics. However, in the case of the Third World, there's also an economic order that becomes quite important. Of course, in the First World, you have market capitalism. In the Second World, the communist parties are going to deliver some form of state-controlled socialist economy, or a trajectory toward the development of a socialist economy, not necessarily socialism itself, but that's going to be on the staging ground towards communism. Of course, that's not going to happen in every case, but it is the ordering of the economic system. In the Third World states, you tend to have mixed economies, which means some elements of capitalism and some elements of socialism being accepted as natural parts of the economy. Now, historians would look backward and contend that actually in all of these various first, second, and third worlds, you still have capitalism, socialism, and a blend of the two in all of those economies. That never really goes away, but that's much more clear in the case of developmentalism in the third world economies in the 1950s, at least. One of the most important figures in developmentalism and the development of third world economics and international economics in the 20th century is Raoul Prebisch. Raoul Prebisch is in fact a figure from Argentinian economics and Latin American economics, but he becomes important internationally. As part of the context in the 1940s, you have the formation of the field of development economics worldwide. Also in Argentina, Juan Perón is a sort of right-wing populist nationalist, but he had made labor unions a detachment of the state, which was a sort of left-wing trajectory. So he was blending right-wing and left-wing politics in that case, to the end that you might have a spread of somewhat like a left-wing populist socialism or an acceptance thereof in Argentina, but this was later interpreted to become a threat to the Argentinian state. Additionally, Perón advocated for the bringing of a rail industry, but this became eventually the British companies bringing the rail industry to Argentina. But Perón's government was arguing that Argentina must develop industry that others in the region could not provide. There was an establishment within this political order of El Tercera, or the third position in Argentinian politics in 1946, which was, based on this argument, a sort of centrist position. Raoul Prebisch comes of age in this context. He later becomes the head of the United Economic Commission for Latin America. Prebisch had been born in San Miguel de Tucumán in the northwest of Argentina, and he knew about the plunder of Mount Potosi in Bolivia, which had been the source of Spanish silver, or a key source of Spanish silver during the colonial period. The same site had been the location of the Argentinian Declaration of Independence in 1916. The Prebisch family, who's pictured here, were a blend of the father's German new bourgeois status as an industrialist, 19th century industrialist, and the mother's Argentinian aristocracy. Prebisch himself, who must have been one of the 4 younger boys in this family photograph, although we aren't quite sure of which one he was, went on to study the social and economic schools of the structuralists, being strongly influenced by the French academics such as Claude Lévi-Strauss, who formulated the ideas of structural anthropology and structuralism, and also Fernand Braudel, who was very important for the development of structuralist thinking of history, looking at economic history and the longue durée of history. These two French academics, quite notably Lévi-Strauss and Braudel, had also worked extensively on exchange in Brazilian schools in the development of Brazilian academics in the 1930s, and they were incredibly popular in Latin America across the region. The structuralist schools, prominent worldwide, but especially in Brazil and Argentinian universities, sought to explain the world through understanding the big data, or the big picture, as we now call it. So, Prebisch took up upon these questions. In 1949, he wrote The Economic Development of Latin America and Its Principal Problems. The question was simply, how do you break away from an import-based economy where the sole export is raw materials? Now, this is somewhat difficult for folks based in the United States to think about because the U.S. has never really been a sole raw material export economy. But in this particular case, he's looking at Latin American economies, which have been exporting materials predominantly to Europe and the United States. And his answer to this question, how do you break away from an import-based economy where the sole export is raw materials, is shift from production of raw materials to manufacture of goods with the qualification that trade is still needed and that autarky is completely impractical. And this is very important for the development of the principles of global economic systems. Autarky is essentially the principle that economies can be self-sufficient, and Prebisch's studies conclude that really no economy can actually be an autarky. It's functionally impossible. So there has to be some sort of international collaboration amongst states for the sake of their economies. That is his intellectual position. Now, Raoul Prebisch influences directly the UN position on economics and development. He comes up with several principles of measures for the economic development of underdeveloped countries. Basically, economists who are following his school of thought argue that capital formation should be about 10% of national income, and that third world economies made about 5% of capital formation at most. So the idea was that capital formation in those economies should increase. So, importantly, as a guideline, they put out this 1951 UN report, which basically states that the ratio of exports to national income is ideally right around 20%. Raw materials should not be subject to violent swings in prices, although they were, and the way to do that was to stabilize the prices by offering government subsidies of those prices, essentially to fix those prices within a range. The case of Chile, whose prices for copper remained fixed during 1942 and 1946, while the price of Chile's imports kept on rising with the world market, may be quoted as an illustration of the kind of inequities and obstacles to economic development that may arise, according to this report. This is very important because eventually the copper industry is going to be cited by the United States as a justification for U.S. intervention directly in Chilean politics in the denial of Chileans' democratic small d democracy rights. Out of this report, you will see questions emerge, and we could discuss these questions. So first, for the discussion post, how do you build economies, quote, battered not just by the world depression of the 1930s and the wars of the 1940s, but by the centuries of colonial depredation? How do you build those up? Second, Would new nations also get economic development, or was the Marshall Plan only for Europe? That's a question moving forward as well. UN estimates were essentially that there would be a need to increase national income, transform agrarian to non-agrarian populations, and increase the grain yield of agrarian economies. There were certain strengths. The principle that the better off should help to pay for the education, medical services, very importantly the medical services, and other public services received by other populations in their communities. And this was well established by the non-aligned movement within the United Nations. So as a principle of member states of the United Nations, there had to be public education, there had to be some form of public health. The idea that this principle should also be applied in between wealthier and poorer nations and countries was also relatively new, but accepted by the United Nations. Not accepted by all member states, of course. Infamously, the United States would consistently reject these democratic principles, small d democracy principles in the world arena. There are also weaknesses of this report from a theoretical perspective. Industry and agriculture are only two industries. There are other industries and economies. What other industries could you think of, for example? That's a discussion question. Considered from a market perspective, the report also considers only hard cash, liquid assets, and quote-unquote grants, which are really loans. You can think of student loans as a sort of example here, right? When they say financial aid, they really mean loans. But they didn't actually consider debt forgiveness as a form of grant in the report. And they didn't consider gifted bonds, for example, as a form of finance in the report. Additionally, there are also some weaknesses in over-advocating for credits on tariffs to a certain extent, rather than simply just the elimination to a certain extent of tariffs among certain states that were capitalizing off of tariffs unfairly. So that would be predominantly, for example, states like the United States and Europe during this historical period and up through the present, capitalizing unfairly on these trade practices. So from that global perspective, focus back on these two questions. How do you build economies battered not just by the world depression of the 1930s and the questions of the 1940s, but by the centuries of colonial depredation? And then second, would new nations or should new nations also get economic development, or was the Marshall Plan only for Europe? From the perspective of thinking on the ground in the 1950s. Make a short post and then let's move on.